Presenting
The Complete
Orson Welles
and the Mercury Theater on the Air in The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells.
This is Orson Welles, speaking from London.
as the third man.
Stand by.
We'll be on the air in 15 seconds, Mr. Wells. Yes, I know.
Stand by, everybody.
Mercury Theater on the Air presents Orson Welles as Count Dracula in his own version of Bram Stoker's great novel,
Who knows
Dracula.
what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The shadow knows.
Hello world, welcome to The Complete Orson Welles, brought to you by Dwayne Old Time Radio. This podcast will feature various classic radio programs ranging mostly from 1936 to 1952 that Orson either produced and directed, was featured on, or starred as a guest. If you enjoy my podcast, you can subscribe to receive notifications of new posts. Subscribing is free and only takes a moment. New episodes are posted weekly. If inclined, please leave a rating and or review on your preferred podcast service. Thank you for your support. Hope you enjoyed the genius of Mr. Welles. This week we have two episodes of the Orson Welles Commentaries. This series, Orson Welles basically, as itself a splinter, I guess, he gives his commentary on different topics. The first episode is The first episode is titled Fortune Tellers, GI Entertainment in the Atomic Age, and Food Shortage in Europe. That is the second episode of this series, and that one aired September 23rd, 1945. The second episode we're going to air in this podcast is titled Ike and Britain, Patton's Peace for Germany, and Truman's Little Man Act. This is the third episode of that series, and this one aired September 30th, 1945, so just 7 days after, a week after the previous. Anyway, I'll just shut up.
Stay tuned to this station for KECA's new program with Orson Welles.
This is Orson Welles. Today I'd like to give you two sides of a big argument in Hollywood, and I'm sticking my neck way out and making a couple of predictions. We'll get to that in just a minute.
But first, we want to tell you something about the makers of Lear radios. Many of you may not have heard of Lear radios. We're not surprised, because not many of you fly a plane. But if you do fly, in fact, if you've flown a plane any time since 1930, the name Lear is an old friend to you. For you see, that name has been on fine aircraft radios for more than 15 years. It's been on radios made to keep pilots steadily in touch with their fields, the kind of radios made to guide them unerringly on their courses. This is why we say that since 1930, Lear has been the name men fly by. Now, for the first time, Lear is building home radios, and you can guess what is happening. All that experience with extra precision, all that knowledge of what makes the finest in radio, all that ability to make dependable, efficient sets is going into fine home radios you can get for your home. In a few minutes, we'll tell you more about these Lear home radios. And now, the words we always use on these broadcasts. Mr. Welles' opinions are his own and do not necessarily represent the views of Lear Incorporated.
Where you live, has the world come to an end? Around here, everything seems fairly normal. But according to a man over in Pasadena, the whole works were supposed to be all washed up the day before yesterday. A number of his ardent followers prepared themselves for the explosion by saying their prayers and holding their ears. But my best information is that the world, including Pasadena, is still open for business. But the prophet, occupationally dauntless, is back at his trade. It's the queerest of all trades, this soothsaying, and, whether plied by statesmen or phrenologists, the most dispensable. We have beheld our military leaders, heavy with wisdom and gold braid, recording their guesses on many a front page and getting it wrong every time. And then there's Drew Pearson. As a Washington reporter, he's one of our most valuable institutions. But I think my friend Drew is most diverting in those eerie moments when he picks up his little crystal ball and reads the future. And most of the time, Pearson the prophet gets it right. Accepting only his public guessings, which after all are based on Drew's own canny observation, I take a poor view of all forms of rune casting, augury, bump and wrinkle reading, and horoscope making. Be it political or personal, I think fortune-telling is the bunk. And although I now propose to peer into the future and once upon a time myself broadcast some trifling threats concerning the world's ending, don't think I take myself as seriously as the man in Pasadena. It is not generally known in the typical Drew Pearsonian phrase, and it will be officially denied. But the fact is that I was not born with a veil over my face, and when a babe I was not stolen away by the gypsies. In spite of which serious handicaps, here I go with a whole handful of predictions. Prophecy number 1. 9 countries will have the atom bomb within 3 years. That's the best private guess in our State Department and in the foreign ministries of the world. Prophecy number 2. Eric Johnson, a good man, will do a good job for the motion picture industry. Sub-prediction. The group he's taking charge of will still be called the Hayes Office, and we movie makers still won't be able to put things on the screen which are allowed daily in every comic strip. Prophecy number 3. Next week we'll see a general speed-up in the London Conference of Foreign Ministers. But the peoples of the world will find the results unsatisfactory. Hot tip department. In the Army, the chiefs of the Entertainment Committee are working out a plan for entertainment in the next World War. Bureau of Unanswerable Questions. In the midst of atomic battle, who will entertain who? And where will the performances take place? This brings up the current argument on the matter of USO camp shows. In Hollywood, several of our leading citizens have found time in their busy lives to take a rap at entertainment for the GIs overseas and to raise rumpuses about accommodations and even such vaudevillians trivia as billing and publicity. Now, these beefers are not all of them chronic prima donnas or fluff-brained hands. The most convincing and impassioned of all the complaints came from one of the nicest men I know in our business, Frank Sinatra, who says a lot of USO shows insult the intelligence of the GIs and that lots of special service officers are, to quote him, shoemakers in uniform. Another friend of mine whose service overseas exceeds his record by 17 weary and often dangerous months comes right back at him with language even stronger. This was Marlene Dietrich, who spent the better half of 1 year letting me saw her in half in the Mercury Wonder show for servicemen. Recently, she spent her furlough as our house guest, and before she left for Paris again last week, Marlena reminded me that there have been sent overseas up to now 700 entertainment units. That there's been a show every 2 weeks in every Army and Navy hospital in the country, the grand total being 64,989 performances. I asked Bob Hope about it. Well, I've been traveling all over the world for the last 4 years, Orson, Bob told me, and maybe in some of the places we went to, some of the time, little mechanical things weren't just what they ought to have been. But the effort was always there, and the effort was always good. There have been a lot of beefs about the inefficiency of the whole Army, but we won the war, didn't we? And as for the USO and the special service officers involved in it, a tremendous amount of entertainment went to a tremendous number of boys. They needed it mighty badly. Now I hear this talk about reducing the budget for entertainment, and that's bad. The men overseas are more homesick than they ever were, and they need cheering up more than they ever did. But wait a minute, said Bob. You just wanted a word or two from me. You didn't ask for a book. So I thanked Bob Hope and told him that just about wrapped it up, and I think it does, too. I might add, however, that if General MacArthur can speak out of turn, as a lot of people think he did last week, it isn't very surprising that a couple of actors may possibly have spoken out of turn, too. Sinatra, as a matter of fact, feels every bit as righteous as MacArthur. And with very good reason, too, I think, because the kick he launched wasn't his. Hundreds of fighting men with bad recreational equipment, things like that, asked him overseas as a free, uncensored civilian to speak up in their behalf. But from now on, I guess Frank agrees with me that all squawks against overseas entertainment for GIs had better come from the GIs themselves or be directed to those of us who aren't in uniform and can never do enough. You may remember the woman from Weehawken. Whatever a fan is, she's the opposite. She wrote me the opposite of a fan letter before this radio series even started, demanding to know why it should start at all. Well, here's the second broadcast, and here's another letter from Weehawken already. Dear Madam, you'll excuse me, please, ladies and gentlemen, if I pause again to answer my mail. Dear Madam, concerning my comments on the political scene, you say I sound like one of those starry-eyed dreamers who wants to give a bottle of milk to every Hottentot. To this, madam, I can only say that if giving said milk to said Hottentot will make him a customer for an icebox to keep it in, I think the milk is a good business investment. A couple of days ago in New York, several Americans sat down to the typical meal of a liberated European. The main course consisted of a single canned sardine, and the entire dinner was consumed in about the same length of time it's taken me to tell you about it. Such meals are being held in towns and cities throughout the country, and the difference in the cost is being put into a fund to purchase available food for shipment to our allies in this recent war. May I suggest, madam, that you treat yourself one day next week to such a meal. You may be glad to lose a pound or two. I know I am. Anyway, it'll help you get my point. If we Americans would eat 3 less ounces of meat a week and save the amount or cost of these 3 ounces in money, we'd be able to take care of the meat shortage in Europe for the entire winter. I'd like to see such a program organized with the same ingenuity and enthusiasm we've given to our bond drives. I know we could do it because we are a generous people. We're also shrewd businessmen. Anyway, we have been up to now. We ought to know we can't do business with a bankrupt world. And, madam, the welfare of a woman across the ocean from you is the welfare of Weehawken. The people of Europe, to name just one continent, are your next-door neighbors. Unless they're eating properly, your neighborhood will get to be very run down and shabby-looking. You'll find yourself living in a slum and without any place on our planet to move to. Thanking you for your interest, my dear madam, I remain as ever your obedient servant. Oh, P.S., I find it difficult to believe that last week's mention of bullfighting encouraged the Weehawken young to civil violence and the 10 varieties of mayhem you're kind enough to catalog. But I promise you one more broadcast and the subject is closed. And you know, friends, come to think of it, I'm glad my critic from Weehawken wasn't with us in Tijuana last Sunday afternoon. You remember I told you Rita and I were taking Joe Cotton and Lenore across the border for their first corrida? Well, we arrived at that border with just time enough and then discovered that we'd locked the trunk compartment in the back of the car and left the key at home. The customs men, persuaded that we were so many jewel smugglers, made us park stateside of the line and proceed on foot. Once in Mexico, we chartered a taxicab made out of what must surely have been the second automobile ever built. And in this we floundered and jounced, feeling like the makings of a Maya milkshake for long ages. I reminded my wife and friends what Chesterton had to say about adventure. Adventure, I quoted between agonized gasps, adventure is an attitude taken towards discomfort. And at this, the 4 of us struck the right attitude and the roof of the car. Well, at long last, we came to the bull ring and found a faena in full tilt. It was the first, and I'm very, very much afraid the last, that Joe Cottons will ever see. It happened to be a very bad bullfight, which means it was a very bloody farce. The man and the beast went at each other without the semblance of dignity. And there were, besides, unpleasant accidents. Nothing will convince the Cottons that Rita and I are not more than a trifle touched in the head on this matter of bullfighting. Knowing full well that most of you listening must share their suspicions, certainly their sympathy for the bull, I offer in our defense a little story, a true story. But first, your attention, please, for an interesting announcement.
For just a minute or so, we'd like to tell you a little about the new Lear radios. We say new because they haven't been seen before in homes. Only aviators have had them. They were made only for the exacting service of the airlanes. This kind of manufacture takes special craftsmanship. And it's this kind of craftsmanship Lear knows best. It's the kind of craftsmanship and precise engineering that goes into the Lear radio for your home. The Lear line gives you a wide range to choose from. Some sets include television. Some have record players and automatic record changers. Some provide the wonderful Lear recording you've seen advertised. And there's FM and worldwide shortwave. With all their fine engineering and latest developments, you might expect Lear radios to be high-priced. But they're not. And now, Mr. Wells has a few words about next week.
Well, next week we'll have the story. It turns out there isn't time enough for it now. It goes something like this. Once there was a bull, a fighting bull, whose name was Bonito, and who lived in a ranch where fighting bulls are raised and grew up with his fellows, fed and pampered as such creatures always are, and thoughtfully avoided by all humans, avoided by all, that is, except one, a little boy, the child of one of the ranch hands. Between this fighting bull, Bonito, and this little boy, there grew up a friendship as real and warm as any ever known between a boy and his dog. The villain of this little drama, you'll be glad to hear, is the bullfighter. Better still, there's a happy ending. But now I'll have to say goodbye, in the words of the serial. To be continued. And I promised you, I remember now, to tell about the greatest man in modern popular music. But I haven't room left on this quarter of an hour to do him justice, so we'll put him off till next time. Anybody who guesses his name gets a free membership in the club I'm founding for the occasion. Anybody who can tell me what the sign in the parking lot in front of the ABC studios means gets a handful of free tickets to their favorite radio show and my everlasting gratitude. The sign reads, "No bailment created here." I will repeat that. The exact words of the sign are as follows: "No bailment created here." I asked my lawyer about it. He was evasive. I even asked the man who runs the parking lot. "What does bailment mean?" I demanded, "and who'd want to create it?" "I've been working here for 2 years," he told me, and I've never been able to find out. Maybe I'll have the answer by next week. Anyway, please let me come to call again. Thanks for this time. Till next Sunday, same time, same station, my sponsors, the makers of Lear radios, and I remain as always, obediently yours.
This is the American Broadcasting Company.
Stay tuned for KECA's new commentary, Orson Welles.
This is Orson Welles, come to call again for a talk about people and the things they're doing all over the world. Then there's the story I promised for this week. We'll get to the story in just a minute.
First, just a word about Lear Incorporated. Lear, that's L-E-A-R, makers of Lear radios and sponsors of this program. It may be news to you that Lear has been making radios since 1930. More likely than not, you haven't heard the name Lear until recently. That's because the radios that Lear has been building for 15 years have been very special radios. Radios that were made for a very exacting purpose. They are aircraft radios, the kind of instruments that men stake the safety of their planes and their passengers upon. Today, Lear radios are in use in the air lanes all the way from Alaska to South America. This is why we say, since 1930, Lear has been the name men fly by. Now, for the first time, Lear is making home radios as well as aircraft radios. And when this kind of craftsmanship and forward thinking go into home radios, they become instruments of unusual excellence. We'll tell you more about these sets a little later. Now, Mr. Wells brings you his views and opinions on events as he sees them. The opinions are his own and do not necessarily represent the views of Lear Incorporated.
Ladies and gentlemen, my views are not necessarily represented by the sign I told you about in the ABC parking lot. You remember I mentioned that sign last week. It says, "No bailment created here," and rashly offered free radio tickets to anyone who could decode the phrase for me. Well, I spent most of this last week paying off. Your obedient servant has never had so much mail before in his life. I'm forced to one of two conclusions: that the only people who don't know what to create bailment means are me and the man who runs the parking lot, or that every living member of the Bar Association listens to this show. A solemn thought. To protect myself from distractions like that sign, I've moved this microphone all the way out to our house in Brentwood, California. And although this is still the American Broadcasting Company, I'd like you to know about the new branch studio they've opened in our living room. It'll help explain any unrehearsed sound effects we may feature from time to time, such as the merry jingle of a Cocker Spaniel's license tag, which punctuated some of our more earnest moments on the last broadcast, or the lusty wail of an 8-month-old daughter, a sound I'm expecting any time now from the nursery above. Well, I noticed in the paper there's some talk about a new naval uniform. Seems like a good idea to me. Never could understand why they made sailors' pants so wide at the bottom when they need the material so desperately up above. Eddie Cantor, as you may have heard, added somebody new to his radio show last week, Thelma Carpenter. She's a singer, and in the continuity, she's brought in as a friend of the family, not as a servant. On the air, that's a fine, fresh way of treating a Negro artist. Last night I heard somebody ask Eddie why. In his introduction, he made no mention of the fact that Miss Carpenter's colored. And I liked Eddie's answer. In my life, he said, I've introduced a lot of singers, but I've never described one of them as a white singer. It reminded me of a story about General Eisenhower in London. Before D-Day in Ike's staff, there was a British officer who was pretty stupid and pompous and got on everybody's nerves more than some. An American colonel came to Eisenhower one day with a beef about him. I just can't get anything done, he complained, with that ignorant British blankety-blank so-and-so. I think I know the man you mean, said the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces in Europe. He's certainly the most trying and inefficient officer I've ever had to work with. He is, as you say, ignorant. You have my permission to call him a blankety-blank anytime you want to, because it's true. But you cannot call him a British blankety-blank in my presence. You may describe him as a so-and-so, but I will not tolerate your calling him a British so-and-so. Eisenhower got rid of the so-and-so, and the colonel who called him a British so-and-so was relieved of his duty and went back to the States. Speaking of Eisenhower, we saw his motion picture the other night. We have time, I'd like to tell you about it. First, a word or two about the news. We don't know yet what Ike had to say to Patton, who wants to give Bavaria back to the Nazis, apparently. We'll probably never hear the exact words, which is a shame. Old Blood and Guts has put his foot in it before. This time, my guess is he's in it way over his shiny boots, above the pearl-handled shooting irons, and right up to the well-known lacquered helmet. But the truth is, old B&G isn't the only champion of a soft peace for Germany. Many of the things we're up to in Germany and in Japan are a source of worried suspicion to our recent allies. Jimmy Burns has made the Russians particularly unhappy these last 3 weeks. And Truman's denials notwithstanding, the London Conference of Foreign Ministers is a washout, a hopeless flop. Here at home, men close to the scene are saying that the president's political honeymoon is over. Many top-flight operators who worked their hearts out for Roosevelt at low salaries are now heeding the siren song of better pay, are leaving government for business. According to them, Harry Truman's Little Man Act is wearing thin to the people who are thrown out of work and can't get unemployment insurance. The president won't be able to keep many valuable young men in government service unless he persuades them soon that he's really fighting for the program on which he and Roosevelt were elected. They don't mind a losing battle, but they do want the chance to get at least one belt in before the gong rings. And in England, in the new Labour government, the same kind of young men are grumbling about McDonaldism. Younger Labour members in the House of Commons are insisting out loud that their administration apply the basic policy on which it was elected. For Britain's Foreign Office, the two great problems today, of course, are one, India, where promised radical changes in administration have yet to be made, and two, Palestine, where, past all argument, the doors must be opened much more widely for the Jews of Europe. Domestically, of course, Britain's first problem is the need for food. Friends of mine just off the plane from England say that the British people have getting less to eat now if possible, and during the Blitz. Of course, on the continent, things are immeasurably worse. Well, it seems the woman from Weehawken still thinks I'm a loony who wants to give America away to the foreigners. In her latest letter, she accuses me of wanting to feed the world. Madam, I wish I could. The world is very hungry, and hungry is a bad word. And hunger is not a symptom of peace. Madam, your government and mine promised food for starving Europe. We're not keeping our promise. With other nations, we pledged our share of food to UNRWA. But unlike other nations, we aren't honoring that pledge. What other nations, you ask? Well, Canada, for instance. Canada's just started meat rationing again to try to help stop the spread of famine abroad. Who's to blame? No individual, no group, no agency is willing to admit particular responsibility. Really, it's all of us who've failed, who've fallen down. You know, we promised 4,921 tons of dried eggs. We've not yet delivered a single egg, not even a rotten one. We pledged 3,943 tons of margarine and 34,446 tons of sugar. We failed on those pledges. If it's our fault, Madam, yours and mine, what can we do about it? Well, we can wire the White House, the Secretary of Agriculture, and our congressman. Our congressmen aren't even talking about the matter nowadays. Seems there aren't any votes in Europe. All in all, I think you and I are being pretty poorly represented these days by the politicians we elected to Congress. The Senate, you know, is stripping the Wagner-Murray full employment bill of its meaning and all possible effectiveness. Taft claims there's no panacea to unemployment. Perhaps some of our senators are willing to see a few millions waiting in line at the soup kitchens. But the men who found jobs in wartime, and above all the men who fought in the war, won't be content to consider unemployment one of the blessings of peace. Last week, I started a story dedicated to all those who've been objecting to our references to bullfighting and who sympathize with the bull. A fighting bull is the hero of this story, and it's a true story. His name was Bonito. He grew up in a place where fighting bulls are raised, with a little boy, the son of one of the ranch hands. They spent most of their time together, these two. They were as close friends as a boy and his dog ever are. Now, if I were to tell you that my daughter was playing in the jungle with a lion or a king cobra, it would be no less remarkable than this, because no living thing is more innately vicious, more terribly dangerous, more untamable than the fighting bull. And Bonito was no weakling to all appearances. He was the superior of any of the animals bred up to that time on that famous ranch. Yet, he was like a puppy with a little boy. And as he grew, as wise and gentle as a good old horse, retired to the pastures. Well, imagine the consternation when the two were discovered together one day, the beast feeding out of the child's hand. It was believed by all that despite his handsome looks, Bonito would prove a coward. When his time came to be sent to the city for the corrida, the owner doubted little that here was an animal appointed to disgrace a proud breed. The little boy ran off in the night and followed to the place where his beloved pet must meet his death. A sad time for the little boy, you can be sure. Before the tragedy, he went to pray for the creature to whom he had given all his childish love. And there, in the chapel, kneeling at the altar beside him, the little boy saw the great matador who was to kill Bonito, or be killed by him. They prayed side by side, the boy for the bull's life, the torero for his own, then left by separate doors. The bullfighter to prepare for the paseo, to brief his quadrilla, to wait in the shadows under the arena, sweating with fear, as matadors always do, even on the coolest afternoon. The little boy to spend a last tearful moment with his friend, the big, black, wise-looking beast, waiting for death in the wooden cage. Music and the great roar of the crowd. Doors suddenly opened before the bull. The hornet sting of the ranch colors spiked into the great hump of muscle on his back. A fine entrance. Here was a great bull, and the crowd knew it. The critics leaned forward in their seats. Now, a great faena is preserved for the students of the art in careful records. And to this day, we know exactly how the great bull and the great matador worked together in the blazing plaza on that historic afternoon. Every move of the cape, how Bonito charged and charged again, straight as a locomotive, noble as a hero out of Homer. But of all this, the little boy saw nothing. He could not watch. If he had tried, he would have seen nothing for the tears. Then came time for the kill. The moment of truth, the Spaniards call it. The sword was raised. Silence choked the plaza. Then, at the very last instant, the stillness was shattered by the cry of a trumpet. The executioner lowered his sword, smiling. Hand flushed with such triumph as comes in a lifetime, to few men left the arena. His adversary, still furiously alive, stood his ground under the cruel sun. Then spoke the highest authority of the corrida, addressing himself in formal tones to the victorious bull. Bonito, you are more than brave. We have seen you reaffirm the dignity and splendor of the art and of the breed. We, therefore, pardon you. Go back to the place of your birth and beget more of your kind. And so it happened, as sometimes happens, but very rarely, that for extreme bravery, a bull was spared his life. But Bonito, still blind with rage, understood no word of this, and feeling no gratitude, refused to leave the ring. They sent the cows in after him, but he turned on them, and they, poor creatures, stampeded, panicked. He had won this ground in battle, and he would not budge. Then a great gasp, a shudder of fear and outrage went up in the plaza. Somehow, a little boy had jumped into the center of the ring. Men turned their eyes away from the expected horror, but when they looked again, wonder of wonders, there was the little boy standing cool and safe beside Bonito, this phenomenon of fury, this terror among fighting bulls. And what was the child doing? Patting the head between the frightful horns. And if they'd known it, whispering words of comfort to an old friend. Amazed, they saw the great Bonito nuzzle this child like a colt, then move politely after him, like a little dog, out of the ring. And so the two went back to their ranch together, and Bonito, according to the terms of his pardon, had many brave sons. And in the fullness of time, so did his little friend. Since this story is perfectly true, I'm very glad to tell you that they both lived happily ever after. Before I leave, I'd like you to hear about an awfully good picture we saw last night. But first, your attention, please, for an interesting announcement.
Now, just a word about Lear home radios. You'll probably know why I emphasize the word home. It's because the name Lear has been known mostly for its very fine aircraft radios. Now, the kind of skill and craftsmanship that make Lear aircraft radios so outstanding is going into radios that you can buy for your home. Some models include television. Some have the wonderful Lear wire recorder. And there are record players with automatic record changers and new static-free FM and world-scanning shortwave. With so much quality and advanced engineering knowledge built into these radios, you might expect that they'd cost a lot. But that just isn't so with Lear radios. They're right along in price with radios far less distinguished. There's a table model at $19.95. And at the other end of the line, there's a beautiful console with the best of everything at $500. The more you appreciate fine reproduction, the more you'll recognize their fine performance and agree that Lear gives you the most for every dollar you spend. Remember the name Lear, L-E-A-R. And now a few words about next week.
Like you, we thought we had our fill of war commentaries, but The True Glory by Carol Reed and Garson Kanin is by so much the best that we abandoned all resistance to more battle footage and gave in to a really great experience. The True Glory. It's the Eisenhower picture. Please don't miss it. Well, now the clock tells me I must say goodbye. Please let me come to call again. And thanks for this time. Until then, speaking for my sponsors, the makers of Lear radios, and my daughter upstairs, who's been nice enough not to spoil her daddy's broadcast, I remain, as always, obediently yours.
This is the American Broadcasting Company.
10:30 at KECA, Los Angeles.
Thank you for listening to and showing your support for my podcast. If you would like to receive notifications of when new episodes are posted, please subscribe to my channel. Subscriptions are 100% free, and they really help me get an idea of how I'm doing. Well, hope you enjoyed, and until next time, stay safe, wish you well, and as always, peace.